0824. She ran barefoot through the rain, an ivory shawl clutched to her chest, the wet spruce needles cutting her soles as she crashed into the forest behind the white clapboard chapel. She did not look back at the bell tower or the men in their Sunday coats waiting in the pews. She chose the grizzly-haunted timber of the Alaskan Panhandle over the bed of a man twice her age who smelled of fish oil and bay rum. This is her story. The year was 1889, and Skagway was not yet the boomtown the Klondike Rush would soon make it. It was a sodden cluster of cedar-shake roofs and tidal flats at the head of the Lynn Canal, where the rain fell 200 days a year and the spruce trees grew so close together a man could lose himself between them in 20 paces. It was a place where the law lived 200 miles south in Sitka and arrived when it arrived by steamer. Eliza Thornberry was 18 years old. She had hair the color of wet cedar bark and gray-blue eyes that had once belonged to her mother. Her father had been a Presbyterian missionary out of Pittsburgh, sent north to teach the Tlingit children English and the Book of Matthew. He had drowned in the Lynn Canal when Eliza was 9, his canoe overturned in a squall the elders said any fool should have read in the clouds an hour before. Her mother had followed him into the ground inside a year, of grief mostly, though the doctor in Juneau wrote it down as consumption. The mission took Eliza in. The mission in those days was Reverend Silas Marlowe and a Chinese Tlingit widow named Mei Ling Chen, who cooked and washed and taught the smaller children to read. Mei Ling had buried 2 husbands and 1 daughter, and she folded Eliza into her household the way a woman folds a clean sheet, with no ceremony and a great deal of care. For 9 years, Eliza had been Mei Ling's shadow, learning to fillet a king salmon, to weave cedar bark, to read the Book of Ruth in 3 languages, and to keep her opinions in her teeth. The mission's debts had grown quietly. The way moss grows on a north-facing log, Reverend Marlowe did not speak of them at supper. He spoke of grace and of the harvest and of the souls being saved in the village across the inlet. But the ledger in his study told another story, and the man who held the loudest line on that ledger was Cyrus Penhaligon. Penhaligon was 52 years old, a broad, pink-faced Cornishman who had come north with the first salmon canneries and stayed to own them. He owned the cannery at Dyea and the cannery at Haines, and the wage scrip the workers were paid in, which could only be spent at the company store. He owned the steam launch that ran the inlet and the dock it tied up to. He was a widower 3 times over, though no one in Skagway spoke of his wives, and his eyes, when they landed on a young woman, had the flat curiosity of a halibut on a slab. Reverend Marlowe was a different kind of man, and that was the trouble. He was 47 and lean and sober, and his sermons made grown loggers weep. He had married Tlingit couples and buried prospectors, and stood in cold water to baptize a Chinese cook who could not afford the passage home. The town loved him. The town would not hear a word against him. And so when Reverend Marlowe announced, on a wet Sunday in March, that the Lord had moved upon Brother Penhaligon's heart to forgive the mission's debts in exchange for the hand of Sister Eliza in holy matrimony, the congregation said Amen. Eliza had not been told beforehand. She sat in the second pew in her good blue dress and felt the blood leave her face. Beside her, Mei Ling's small brown hand closed over her wrist so hard it left a bruise that lasted 4 days. That night, in the kitchen behind the chapel, Mei Ling lit a single tallow candle and spoke to Eliza in the low-fast Cantonese she used only when she did not want the Reverend to overhear. "You will not marry that man, Eliza girl. You hear me?" "You will not, Auntie," the Reverend said. The Reverend says many things. The Reverend is a wolf in a clean collar. I have seen what becomes of girls in Penhaligon's house. 2 of them lie in the cannery yard under stones with no names. Mei Ling pressed something into Eliza's hands, the ivory wedding shawl that had been her mother's. "You will wear this on the day. You will wear it and you will not take it off. Promise me." "Auntie, why promise me?" "I promise." 3 days before the wedding, Mei Ling Chen was found at the foot of the chapel garden steps with her neck broken. Reverend Marlowe wrote it in the parish book as a fall. The rain had been heavy, he said. The stones were slick. He preached a beautiful sermon about the faithful servant entering into her rest. Eliza was not permitted to weep at the burial. A bride, the Reverend said, must compose herself for the joy ahead. She did not sleep for the 3 nights between Mei Ling's grave and her wedding morning. The morning of the wedding, the sky over the Lin Canal hung the color of pewter, and the rain came down steady as a man counting coins. Eliza stood in the vestry of the chapel in her mother's ivory shawl and a borrowed white dress that smelled of cedar chests and someone else's lavender. Through the thin wall, she could hear the congregation murmuring, the floorboards creaking under Penhaligon's weight. The reverend's measured pacing, a bootjack of cast iron sat on the windowsill. The window itself was old, the putty soft from the wet. Eliza did not weep. She had done her weeping for Mei Ling. She wrapped the shawl tight against her chest, lifted the bootjack in both hands, and drove it through the rippled glass. She climbed out of the window with her hem catching on the splinters, dropped barefoot into the mud of the chapel garden, and ran. She ran past Mei Ling's fresh grave with its raw mound of earth. She ran past the woodshed and the chicken coop and the rotted stump where the children had played house in summer. She ran into the dripping black wall of spruce that began where the mission's fence ended, and she did not stop until the chapel bell was a small thing behind her and the rain had washed the chapel bell out of her ears entirely. Inside the chapel, Reverend Marlowe opened the vestry door, saw the broken window, and stood very still for the space of 3 breaths. Then he walked unhurried to the back of the chapel where Cyrus Penhaligon waited in a black wool coat. "The girl has fled," Marlowe said. Penhaligon's pink face did not change, and the shawl, she wore it out. Penhaligon nodded slowly. "Then she has it on her. Send Quill $500 to the man who brings her back, 1,000 if the shawl is still around her shoulders and the threads have not been picked at, and if she has spoken to anyone, no one to speak to between here and Daae but spruce trees and bears. Send Quill." Captain Roderick Quill was a Liverpool man with a knife scar that ran from his left eyebrow down into his beard. He ran the Canaries steam launch and 3 enforcers who answered to him, a Swede named Bergstrom, a Boston Irishman named Doyle, and a quiet half-breed tracker named Charlie Two Crows, who had been bought out of a Yukon jail and owed Penhaligon his teeth. Within the hour, the launch was chuffing up the inlet, its black smoke smearing the grey sky, and Charlie Two Crows was on the shore reading the broken spruce. Twigs Eliza had left behind her like a confession. She ran until her lungs burned and her bare feet had gone past pain into a strange cold absence. The forest closed behind her like a curtain. The rain came down through the canopy in cold, heavy ropes. She had no boots, no food, no plan beyond putting another spruce between herself and the chapel. By the time the grey daylight began to fail, she had climbed a long, shallow ridge and descended into a fern hollow where a creek ran black between mossy stones. Her dress was torn from hem to knee. The ivory shawl was sodden and heavy as wet sail. Her teeth had begun to knock together in a rhythm she could not stop. Somewhere down the inlet, very faint, she heard the chug of a steam engine working against the tide. She crawled into the hollow under a leaning cedar where the moss was thick and the rain came through only in drips, and she pulled the shawl over her head, and she thought of Mei Ling lying at the foot of the garden steps with her neck at the wrong angle, and the dark came down on her like a closing hand. She did not hear the man approach. He moved on the forest floor the way a heron moves on a tidal flat, which is to say not at all, and then suddenly very close. Jonas Vance was 39 years old. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his moccasins, and he wore a long, oiled canvas coat the color of wet bark. He had been a surveyor for the Hudson's Bay Company for 12 years before he had quit, and he had built his cabin on a glacier-fed shelf 3 miles inland from the Tyre River. His mother had been a Tlingit woman of the Raven moiety out of the Chilkat village, and his father had been a Scottish trader out of Inverness, and Jonas had taken from each of them what was useful and discarded the rest. He spoke 4 languages and trusted none of them entirely. He was checking a marten trap that morning when the rain shifted and he caught, on the back eddy of the wind, the smell of crushed fern and human fear. He found her in the hollow under the cedar. He stood over her for a long moment, the rain running off the brim of his felt hat. A young woman, white soaked through mission school hands, an ivory shawl that had cost someone a week's wage. trouble. The kind of trouble that came with men on the water and questions in town. He thought, for the space of 3 breaths of walking on. Then he thought of his wife, Annie, and his son, Robert, both dead these 4 years of the measles that had come north on a Penhaligon labour ship out of Vancouver. Annie had been 26. Robert had been 11 months old. The cannery had not paid $1 of compensation. The Reverend, when Jonas had carried his dead son into the chapel for burial, had spoken at length about the mysterious workings of Providence. Jonas Vance did not believe in Providence. He believed in maps and in the tide tables and in the weight of a thing in his own 2 hands. He bent and lifted Eliza Thornbury out of the moss and carried her the 2 miles to his cabin with her face against the wet canvas of his coat and her bare feet hanging blue. The cabin was a single room of squared spruce logs chinked with moss and tar. A stone fireplace took up one wall. A drafting table under the small grease-paper window held a half-finished chart of the Tyre Inlet, the soundings inked in Jonas's small, precise hand. A bearskin lay on the plank floor. A Winchester Model 1873 hung on 2 pegs above the door, and a Hudson's Bay axe leaned in the corner. He did not bother with modesty. He stripped the wet dress and shawl off her, and wrapped her in 3 trade blankets and the bearskin, and he built the fire up until the chimney roared. He thawed her feet slowly with handfuls of cold water from the rain barrel, the way his mother had taught him, easing the blood back into the toes before the warmth could kill the tissue. He spooned warm broth of dried king salmon and nettle between her cracked lips. He hung the ivory shawl and the dress on a line above the fire, and the steam rose off them like the breath of something living. She burned with fever through the first night and into the second. She spoke, in the fever, of a woman named Mei Ling and a chapel bell and a man with a flat halibut stare. Jonas listened and did not write any of it down, but he remembered. On the morning of the 3rd day the fever broke. She opened her grey-blue eyes and saw the elk antlers mounted on the cabin wall and smelled the wood smoke and the rendered seal oil in the lamp, and she saw the enormous bearded man sitting on a 3-legged stool across the room, mending a snowshoe, binding with a bone awl. She did not scream. She had used up her screaming. Where am I? Jonas did not look up from the snowshoe. My cabin? 3 miles inland from the Tyre. You've been here 2 days. Who are you? Jonas Vance. Are you one of his men? Jonas set the snowshoe down. Whose men? Penhaligons. Or the Reverend's. He looked at her then, with eyes the color of wet slate. I am no one's man, miss. I found you in a fern hollow on my ridge. You'd have been dead by morning. She tried to sit up, and the room turned a slow half-circle, and she lay back. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Jonas will do Eliza Thornbury. I gathered. A silence. The fire popped. The rain drummed on the cedar shake roof in a rhythm that had not stopped in 3 days. I cannot pay you, Eliza said. I did not ask. They will come looking for me. I gathered that as well. Mr. Vance. Jonas, you cannot keep me here. They will burn this cabin. Jonas picked up the snowshoe again. Tomorrow at first light I will guide you to Die. There is a Norwegian schooner that runs salt cod down to Sitka twice a month. The captain owes me a favor. He will take you. After that, you are no concern of mine. Thank you. Don't thank me. I want no trouble on this ridge. She turned her face to the wall and wept quietly for Mei Ling for the first time since the burial. Jonas Vance kept his eyes on the snowshoe binding and pretended not to hear, which was the kindest thing he had done for a stranger in 4 years. Tomorrow did not come the way Jonas had planned it. He woke before dawn to the sound he had been half listening for in his sleep. A steam engine working hard against the tide, the chuff and hiss of it carrying up the river valley in the wet, still air. He rolled out of the bunk and pulled on his coat and was at the grease-paper window in 3 steps. Below, through the spruce, he could see the smear of black smoke where the inlet opened, a launch tied off at his river mouth. 3 figures moving on the shingle. A 4th crouched by the water reading the ground. Eliza, he spoke quietly so as not to startle her. Get up, get dressed, they are here. She came awake all at once, the way prey animals do. She pulled on the dried dress and the ivory shawl with hands that shook only a little. Jonas took the Winchester down from the pegs above the door and livered around into the chamber and pushed 3 more cartridges into the side gate. Listen to me, you stay behind the woodbox. You do not come out for anything. If they kill me, you take the trail behind the cabin north for half a mile, then west along the ridge until you strike the glacier. Follow the glacier down to the inlet. The schooner I told you about ties up at the third pier from the north end of Dyea. Captain Halverson, you tell him Jonas Vance sent you and you owe him nothing. You understand me? Yes. Say it back. North half a mile west to the glacier, down to the inlet, third pier, Captain Halverson. Good girl. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the heavy door shut behind him. The four men came up the trail through the rain in a loose line, Charlie Two Crows in front reading the sign, Doyle and Bergstrom behind him with Winchesters of their own, Captain Roderick Quill at the rear, a cut-down 10-gauge coach gun cradled in his arms and his knife scar dark in the grey light. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, 30 yards from the cabin. "Morning, surveyor," Quill called out. His voice was bright and false. "Fine little homestead you've got here. Mighty far from the company store." Jonas did not answer. He stood on the porch with the Winchester loose across his forearm and the rain running off his hat. "We're looking for a runaway, Mr. Vance. A young lady Penhaligon's intended. Wandered off in a fit of nerves yesterday morning. Pretty thing, dark hair, ivory shawl. Charlie says she came up this way." Quill smiled, showing brown teeth. "Mr. Penhaligon is anxious. Reverend Marlowe is anxious. There's a $500 token of gratitude for the man what brings her home. I have not seen her. Charlie says different." Charlie is mistaken. Charlie Two Crows did not look up from the ground. He pointed with one finger at the print of a bare foot in the mud at the edge of the clearing. Quill's smile widened. "Charlie is rarely mistaken, Mr. Vance. Be reasonable, hand her over. We'll be down the trail before the tide turns, and you can go back to your charts and your salmon, and no one need say a word about a half-breed hermit harboring stolen goods." Jonas raised the Winchester to his shoulder in one smooth motion. He did not aim at Quill. He aimed at the canvas-wrapped bundle lashed to Bergstrom's pack, a folded canoe of birch bark and spruce gum 18 feet long, the men's only way back to the launch if the tide stranded them. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the clearing and the canoe burst open in a spray of splinters and pitch. The four men dropped flat in the wet ferns. Quill was screaming before he hit the ground. "You damned fool! You damned half-breed fool!" Jonas levered another round into the chamber. "The girl is not stolen goods. She is not goods at all. You go back down to your launch, Captain. You tell Penhaligon his marriage is off. You tell the Reverend his sermon went long. And if you cross my creek again, I will not aim at the canoe." Quill lifted his head out of the ferns. The brown smile was gone. "Penhaligon himself will be on the next tide, surveyor with 20 men. And the marshal in Sitka is on his payroll, in case you were entertaining notions. Then he will come. Hey, he will." Quill backed down the trail on his hands and knees for the first 10 yards, which Jonas allowed him for the sake of his dignity, and then the four of them rose and ran. The chug of the steam engine started up again 10 minutes later and dwindled down the inlet. Jonas stood on the porch in the rain for a long time, after the smoke was gone. Inside, Eliza had come out from behind the woodbox. She was shaking, but she was on her feet. She had taken down the ivory shawl from the line above the fire to wrap around her shoulders, and as she lifted it, the firelight caught a strange small irregularity in the lining along the bottom hem, a place where the silk lay not quite flat, where the stitches were a different color from the rest. She frowned. She ran her fingers along the hem. There was something inside. Jonas. He had come in and was barring the door. "What?" "There is something sewn into my mother's shawl." He crossed the room in 3 steps. She turned the hem to the firelight. The stitches along a 4-inch section were small and recent and a slightly different shade of cream. The work of someone in a hurry who had wanted the repair invisible at a glance. Jonas drew his belt knife and slit the threads, gently the way a man opens a fish. A folded square of oilcloth fell into Eliza's palm. She unfolded it on the plank table by the fire. It was a hand-drawn map, in pencil and a wash of tea to age the paper, of the upper Tyre River Valley and the foothills toward the Chilkoot. Jonas knew the country well enough to read it at a glance. He had surveyed half of it himself. But there were marks on this map that did not belong to any survey he had drawn, a compound of buildings 2 miles up the Pleasant Camp Creek, marked in a small careful hand, barracks, kitchen, sluice, 8 guards. Beside it a number 47 souls, and a notation Tlingit 22, Chinese 1906 children, debt bondage, no wages since November. In the lower margin, in the same hand, 4 lines of writing to the Deputy Marshal at Sitka. Cyrus Penhaligon, Silas Marlowe, Roderick Quill, trust no collar. M. Chen. Eliza put her hand over her mouth. Mei-ling, she whispered. Auntie Mei-ling drew this. Jonas had gone very still. He read the map a second time and a third. When he spoke, his voice had changed. How long had your auntie kept this in the shawl? I don't know. She gave me the shawl 2 weeks before. Before she fell, she made me promise to wear it on the wedding day. She made me promise. She did not fall, Eliza. No, they killed her for this map. Yes, and the wedding was never about you. Eliza sat down slowly on the 3-legged stool. The room was very quiet, except for the fire and the rain. It was about getting the shawl back, she said. He thought I'd wear it to the altar. He thought once I was his, he could take it off me and burn it, and no one would ever know what Mei-ling had drawn. That is what I think as well. Then Eliza's voice cracked. Then she used me. She put it in my shawl and did not tell me. She let me walk to a wedding with it on my shoulders. She trusted you to run, Eliza. Eliza looked up at him. The tears stood in her eyes, but they did not fall. How could she have trusted that? Because she raised you. The fire popped. Outside the rain had not stopped, but it had thinned to the steady sift that meant the heavy weather had passed and the tides would run clean for a day or two. Jonas folded the oilcloth map and put it inside his shirt against his skin. We do not wait for Penhaligon to come up the river with 20 men. We go down tonight. The schooner will not sail for a week. But the marshal in Sitka, the Marshal Quill named, is not the only law in the District of Alaska. There is a deputy out of Sitka named Hannah Greaves. She has come up the inlet twice this winter looking into the cannery. If your auntie wrote a letter to Sitka, she will have written it to Greaves. We get to Daya. We find Greaves's cutter, or we find a man who will run a message to it. We do not stop and we do not sleep until that map is in a federal hand. They will have men on the trail. They will have men on the trail and men on the water. We will not take the trail and we will not take the water. We will take the rocks along the shore at the low tide, and we will go through the sea cave at the mouth of the Taya where the launch cannot follow. And if they are waiting in the sea cave, Jonas looked at her for a long moment. Then we will not be the only ones surprised, he said. They left the cabin in the blue hour before true dawn. Jonas wore his oiled canvas coat and carried the Winchester and a possibles bag with the map sewn now into the lining of his own coat, where he could feel it against his ribs. Eliza wore a pair of his dead wife Annie's wool trousers, cinched with a length of rope, one of Annie's flannel shirts, a sealskin parka that swallowed her, and a pair of moccasins stuffed with dry moss. The ivory shawl was folded small in the bottom of the bag. She would not leave it behind. They went down the ridge through the wet spruce in silence. Jonas led. He did not use the trail. He used the ways his mother had shown him when he was a boy, the deer runs, the back eddies of the slope, the places where a man on a switchback trail above could not see a man moving below. The rain had thinned to mist. The sky over the inlet was bone white. They reached the shore 3 miles below the river mouth at the bottom of the tide. The Lynn Canal lay flat and grey, and the tide was so far out the mussel beds shone black to the horizon, and the gulls walked on the flats with the dignity of magistrates. 2 hours, Jonas said. 2 hours before the tide turns. The cave is a mile down the shore. We must be through it and out the other side before the water comes back, or we will be in it when it fills. And if Penhaligon is in the cave, then we will be quick. They went down onto the wet rock and the black sand, and they moved south along the shore at the foot of the cliffs. The cliffs rose to their left in walls of dripping basalt, hung with maidenhair fern, and the inlet opened to their right in a flat grey plate. Jonas moved like a man who knew the shape of every stone. Eliza followed in his footprints. They came to the mouth of the sea cave 40 minutes later. It was a great black opening in the foot of the headland, 20 feet high at its tallest, hung with kelp and barnacles. The floor of it was wet rock and rounded stones, slick with weed. The tide was 3 feet below the lower lip. The cave ran perhaps 200 yards through the rock and opened, Jonas said, on a small shingle beach on the Daya side, from which the third pier and Captain Halverson's schooner were a 40-minute walk. Jonas paused at the mouth. He listened. The cave breathed in and out with the small surge of the slack tide, a faint hollow sound like a man asleep. Then, very faint, From deep in the cave, the scrape of a boot on stone. Jonas's hand went up. Eliza froze. A voice made huge and strange by the cave came rolling out of the dark. "Mr. Vance, Miss Thornbury, do come in out of the weather." It was Reverend Silas Marlowe. Jonas pushed Eliza behind him against the cave wall. He raised the Winchester. He did not answer. "Mr. Vance, I have known of this cave since I came north. I have baptized children on the shingle on the far side. You are a clever man, but you are not the first clever man I have outwalked. Captain Quill is at the Daae end with 3 rifles. I am at this end with Brother Penhaligon and 2 more. The tide will turn in approximately 90 minutes and rise approximately 13 feet. The cave will fill. You and the young lady are welcome to swim, but I would not recommend it in those clothes." Jonas spoke quietly, very close to Eliza's ear. "Stay against the wall. Move when I move. Do not fire a weapon. There is something else I need you to do." "What?" "There is a launch tied to a ring bolt on the rocks outside this end of the cave. I heard the engine before we came down. They will have left a man with it. When I draw their fire, I want you to slip back out of the cave and cut the painter. The rope, the tide is still going out for another 20 minutes. The launch will drift. Without it, Quill and his men on the Daae side are stranded on a shingle beach with the tide coming in around them, and Marlowe and Penhaligon on this side are trapped between my rifle and the water. With what do I cut the rope?" Jonas reached into his possibles bag and pressed a thing into her hand. It was a fishing gaff, 18 inches long, a wicked curved steel hook on a hardwood handle, the kind a man used to lift a 40-pound salmon over a gunwale. The blade of the hook is honed. Saw, do not chop, stay low, stay behind the rocks, do not look back. Jonas, go when I shoot. He stepped 1 stride forward into the mouth of the cave and fired the Winchester into the dark. The muzzle flash lit the cave for a half-second like a lightning strike. Eliza saw in that half-second the figures of Marlowe and Penhaligon and 2 enforcers behind a tumble of rocks 40 feet in. She saw Marlowe in his black coat with his white collar still buttoned at his throat. She saw Penhaligon's pink halibut face. Then she was moving, low, back out of the cave mouth and onto the shore. The launch was where Jonas had said 50 yards down the shingle, tied by a thick hemp painter to an iron ring driven into the rocks. A man sat on the gunwale with a Winchester across his knees, Doyle, the Boston Irishman, smoking a damp cigarette and watching the cave mouth. Behind her, in the cave, the gunfire opened up in earnest. Marlowe's voice rose, no longer the measured baritone of the pulpit, but a thin, cracking scream. Take him alive if you can, but take him." Penhaligon's voice cut under it, flat and furious, the booming of the Winchester, the flatter snap of pistols, the huge muddled echo of all of it inside the rock. Doyle stood up on the gunwale and stared at the cave, his back to Eliza. Eliza went down on her hands and knees on the wet shingle and crawled along the base of the rocks to the iron ring. The painter was wet hemp as thick as her wrist. She drew the gaff. She set the honed inner edge of the hook against the rope and she sawed. The rope parted strand by strand. She could feel the launch pulling against it on the outgoing tide. Doyle did not turn. The gunfire in the cave was a wall of sound. The last strand parted with a small dull pop. The launch slid backward off the shingle into the inlet. Doyle felt it go under his feet and gave a strangled shout and pitched forward into the gunwale, and the launch tipped and rolled him into the cold grey water. He came up swearing and floundering. The launch turned slowly broadside to the current and began to drift, smoke still curling from her stack, out into the Lynn Canal toward the open water. Eliza did not look back. She crawled along the rocks until she was clear of the cave mouth, and then she ran along the shore in a low crouch back to where she could see the cave entrance. Inside, the gunfire had changed. There were fewer guns, and they were no longer firing outward. Jonas had moved up along the cave wall in the dark while his enemies fired at the mouth. He had taken Penhaligon's 2 enforcers, one with the Winchester and one with the heavy belt knife, in the kind of close, quiet work he had not done since his Hudson's Bay days and had hoped never to do again. Reverend Silas Marlowe was on his knees behind a wet boulder. His white collar was dark with seawater and sweat. He was praying aloud, not the smooth pulpit prayer the congregation knew, but a child's prayer, fast and breathless. Now I lay me down to sleep." Cyrus Penhaligon stood beside him with his back to the cave wall and a Colt revolver in his hand and his pink face gone the color of cod belly. "Penhaligon," Jonas said from the dark, "drop the pistol. Vance, drop it or I drop you." Penhaligon dropped the pistol. It clattered on the wet stone. "The launch is gone," Jonas said. "Your captain on the other side is on a shingle with the tide coming in. The Reverend's God is not answering this morning. Sit down against the wall. Both of you, put your hands flat on the stone." They sat. The tide had turned. The water had begun, very gently, to come back into the cave. A thin sheet of it ran across the floor and lapped at Marlowe's polished shoes. Eliza came in through the mouth of the cave with the gaff still in her hand. She stopped 10 feet from where the Reverend sat against the wall. He looked up at her with his face wet and grey. "Eliza," he said, "child, there has been a terrible misunderstanding." She did not answer him. She looked at him for a long time until he could not hold her eyes, and then she looked away. "Auntie Mei-ling did not fall," she said. "To Jonas, not to the Reverend." "No," Jonas said. "She did not." "Good." They were still standing in the cave with the water rising around their ankles when the small clean note of a brass whistle came across the water from the south. The deputy marshal's cutter rounded the headland in the first true light of morning, a 40-foot steam launch out of Sitka, with the federal pennant snapping wet at her mast. Deputy Marshal Hannah Greaves stood in the bow in a long oilcloth coat, with a Winchester in the crook of her arm and her badge pinned through the coat itself, so the rain would not lift it. She was 44 years old, and she had come up the inlet because 3 weeks before a letter had reached her in Sitka, written in a careful hand, signed M. Chen, Skagway Mission, describing a labor camp on the Pleasant Camp Creek and 4 lines of names. She had been working her way up the coast since. The cutter took Penhaligon and Marlowe off the rocks at the cave mouth in Irons. A second boat went around the headland and took Roderick Quill and his 2 enforcers off the Dyer side shingle, where the tide had risen to their knees and was rising still. Doyle was fished out of the inlet half a mile down current, blue and swearing. On the cutter's deck, in the small wheelhouse out of the rain, Eliza Thornbury opened the oilcloth on the chart table, and Deputy Marshal Greaves read it through twice without speaking. When she had finished, she folded it and put it inside her coat against the badge. 47 souls, Greaves said. 6 children. Yes, ma'am. You will testify in Sitka, Miss Thornbury. Federal court. It will be ugly. Penhaligon has friends and lawyers and a great deal of money, and the Reverend has a congregation that will not want to hear what their Reverend was. You will be called a liar and worse. Yes, ma'am. You understand what you're agreeing to. I understand. Greaves looked at her for a moment with eyes the color of weathered cedar. Then she nodded once, the way one workman nods to another, and went out to give an order to her helmsman. Jonas was standing at the stern rail. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour. The first time it had stopped in 8 days, and the light coming down the inlet was the strange white gold light particular to the Panhandle when the weather breaks at dawn, the kind of light that makes the glaciers up the valley look as though they are lit from inside. Eliza came and stood beside him. She had the ivory shawl folded over her arm. She did not put it on. "They will give you something for the men in the camp," she said. "Greaves will, the federal court will, the cannery will go to receivership. The camp will be broken up. It will take months, but it will be done, and the Reverend will hang Eliza." Good. They stood a while in silence and watched the inlet slide past. Jonas. When this is over, when I have testified, I have nowhere to go back to. I know. The mission is finished. Auntie Mei-ling is in the ground. My father and mother have been in the ground these 9 years. I have no people. I know that too. She turned to him. He was looking down the inlet at the glacier light on the water, with the small-bone deep stillness of a man who was waiting to hear a thing he was not sure he had earned the right to hear. "I was too young to be that man's wife," she said. "I think I'm old enough to be your witness in a federal court. And maybe, in time, if you will have me and if I'm still standing when this is over, something more." Jonas Vance did not smile easily, and he did not smile then, but his eyes, when he turned them on her, were not the slate-grey eyes of the man on the porch with the Winchester. They were something warmer and more tired and more glad. "The Ridge is a hard place, Eliza. I have been in hard places." "Yes," he said. "You have." The cutter chuffed slowly up the Lynn Canal toward Sitka in the new white-gold light. With 2 men in irons in her hold and a hand-drawn map folded against the deputy marshal's badge, and a young woman and a mountain man standing at the stern rail with the rain finally finished and Skagway falling away small and grey behind them. If Eliza's flight through the spruce and Jonas's last stand at the sea cave moved you, do not let the story end here. Tap that like button. Share this true-style tale of frontier courage with anyone who believes that the bravest thing a young woman can do is not lift a rifle but live to tell the truth in a federal court. Subscribe for more real-life dramas from the rainy edge of the American frontier. And tell me in the comments if you had been Eliza in that vestry on the wedding morning, with the rain coming down and the Reverend at the door. Would you have gone out through the broken window into the dripping spruce, or would you have stayed?